Today's tale is disturbing, bizarre, and honestly, the more you learn about what happened, the less sense it makes. This is one of those cases where all the physical evidence points in one direction, but that direction is medically impossible. And by the end, you'll have to decide for yourself what you think really happened on the night of October 29, 1928. But before we get into that 1920s noir, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and activate all notifications to never miss the unexplained, forgotten, and twisted tales. I publish it weekly, and your support means everything to this new channel. Alright, here we go. On the evening of October 29, 1928, a 30-year-old woman named Elfrieda Knaak walked out of her last sales appointment in downtown Chicago and stood on a sidewalk for a moment, mentally tallying up her day. 3 encyclopedias said salt. That was better than usual, and she felt good about it. Elfrieda had been working as a door-to-door encyclopedia salesperson for about a year now. It was hard work, long days, lots of rejection, constant travel back and forth from her home in Deerfield, but for a woman in 1928, especially one with college education, it was good money and it gave her independence. Elfrieda had attended both University of Chicago and the University of Illinois, an impressive educational background for a woman in that era. She had taught first grade at Glen Flora School in Waukegan for 4 years before deciding to make the career change to sales. Teaching had been stable, but it hadn't paid well, and she wanted something more. Beyond her work and her piano playing, Elfrieda had developed a deep interest in spiritual practices and mysticism, something that was quite popular in the 1920s. She'd been reading books about transcendent power of suffering, about pain as purifying force, what some call the refiner's fire. She had even formed a friendship with a woman named Luella Rowe just weeks earlier, bonding over their shared fascination with spirituality and occult. And that's something to keep in mind for future. As she stood on that Chicago sidewalk, Elfrieda spotted a music shop a few doors down. She couldn't resist. Piano had been her passion since she was a girl. It was her escape after long days of sales, pitches, and slammed doors. She walked into the shop, browsed the sheet music, and picked out something new for her to learn in the future. Something to look forward to playing that evening when she got home. Around 6:30, Elfrieda found a payphone on the corner, dropped in a coin, and called her sister back in Deerfield. Elfrieda and her sister had always been very close since childhood, and Elfrieda made a habit of checking in most evenings after work. It was partly practical, letting her family know she was safe and when to expect her home, but it was also just nice to hear a familiar voice after a long day. When her sister picked up the phone, Elfrieda told her she'd had a good day, that she'd stopped by to buy some sheet music, and that she should be home by about 7:30. But that's not exactly what actually happened. Instead of boarding a train straight back to Deerfield, Elfrieda purchased a ticket to Highland Park, a different town also north of Chicago. She arrived around 7:30 and made a few phone calls from the station. Then she bought another ticket, this time to Lake Bluff, and notably, this ticket was a round trip. She was planning to come back. Elfrieda boarded the train and arrived in Lake Bluff sometimes after 8 o'clock that evening. Now, Elfrieda didn't live in Lake Bluff. She didn't have family there, but she had been going there regularly for past few months, taking elocution lessons, classes in public speaking and sales techniques. $3 an hour once or twice a week for someone making a living by talking to strangers all day, convincing them to buy expensive encyclopedia, the investment made sense. The classes were helping her to become more persuasive, more confident, and essentially more successful in her new career. Her teacher was a man named Charles Hitchcock. He was 45 years old and worked as the night watchman for the Lake Bluff Police Department. In a town of only about 500 people, they didn't need a fully staffed police force, so Hitchcock worked the overnight shift at the village hall and supplemented his salary by teaching elocution classes on the side. But Hitchcock hadn't always been a small-town cop. Back in 1914, when the silent film industry was still centered in Chicago, he'd been an actor at the famous Essanay studios, the same studio where Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, and Wallace Beery got their starts. Those were the days when Hollywood dreams were born in Chicago before everyone moved west to California. And Hitchcock had been a part of that world, working alongside people who became legends. But his dreams hadn't really survived. While his colleagues moved to California and became stars, Hitchcock stayed behind. The acting roles dried up, the vaudeville stages closed, and eventually he found himself teaching people in suburbs how to speak more convincingly. Whether Elfrieda met with Hitchcock that night, whether they spoke, whether he even knew she was coming to Lake Bluff, nobody really knows. What we do know, however, is what happened 14 hours later. It was Tuesday morning, October 30th, 1928, around 7:30, when Chris Lewis, the 50-year-old janitor at the village hall, made his way down to the basement. The building has gotten too cold overnight and he needed to stoke the furnace to get some heat going. The village hall basement was where the small police department was located. A few offices, a couple of holding cells, a desk here and there, and the night watchman area. Off to one side was a small room, barely more than a little cubby, where the furnace sat. Chris opened the door to the furnace room and stepped inside. And immediately, in a dim morning light, he saw something standing in the corner. A dark figure, motionless in the shadows. For a moment, he genuinely thought he was looking at a ghost. He turned and ran back. Went back upstairs and he got Police Chief Barney Rosenhagen. And after that, both of them came back down together. They moved slowly through that basement. None of them was quite sure what they were about to find. And when they stepped into that furnace room to see what was actually there, they saw something that made them both freeze. A woman was standing in a corner, completely naked, leaning against a pipe next to the furnace for support. Her arms and legs were covered in terrible burns. The hair was gone from her head, her face and forehead were charred to the point that skull was showing through in places. Her toes were burned down to nothing but cinders, and her hands were almost completely gone, just blackened stumps extended up to her elbows. The burns were catastrophic, the kind of injuries that should kill someone very quickly and very painfully, the kind of damage that suggested hours of exposure to intense searing heat. But here's the part that made no sense. The woman was standing. Somehow, impossibly, with injuries that extensive, she remained conscious enough to stand upright, to support herself against that pipe, and to be aware of her surroundings. She was alive. Not just alive, she could respond when they spoke to her. She told them she was cold and somewhat casually asked for water. When they asked her name, she managed to whisper it. Elfrieda Knaak. The same woman who just hours earlier had been standing on the Chicago sidewalk buying sheet music and calling her sister to say she'd be home by 7:30. They wrapped her in a blanket as gently as they could and rushed her to Ellis Home Hospital in Lake Forest. Doctors immediately began working to try to save her life, though they understood almost instantly that kind of injuries were almost certainly fatal. Burns covered more than half of her body, the kind of trauma that would kill most people within hours. But as they examined her more carefully, they found more. Beyond the burns, Elfrieda had marks consistent with electrical shock, and there was evidence of severe blow to the head. For the next 4 days, Elfrieda drifted in and out of consciousness in that hospital bed, heavily sedated against pain that must have been beyond description. Her family came, her brothers, her sisters, all of them devastated and desperate for answers. And as Elfrieda surfaced from the morphine fog at different times, the doctors and nurses found themselves listening to a series of statements that seemed to change with each telling. The story was never the same twice. On the first day, she said something that shocked everyone who heard it. She claimed she had done this to herself. She described it as a purification ritual, a love rite meant to demonstrate the depths of her feelings for a man she called Hitch. In a town of 500 people where everyone knew everyone, only one man went by that nickname: Charles Hitchcock, the night watchman and Elfrieda elocution teacher. Investigators immediately started trying to understand the nature of Elfrieda's relationship with Hitchcock. Was it a student-teacher relationship that had crossed lines? Had Hitchcock somehow convinced her, this educated, accomplished woman, to do something this horrific to herself? And more importantly, how had she gotten into a locked police station in the middle of the night? But as the hours passed and Elfrieda's consciousness came and went, she started saying different things. She mentioned another name. "Frank turned me down," she said at one point. Nobody knew at this point who Frank was. She also made references that suggested someone had prevented her from leaving. According to the detective who questioned her during one of her more lucid moments, Elfrieda explained that she had been sitting on the floor of that basement for a while, and her burns had started to hurt really badly. So she had gotten up, walked to one end of that basement. He was trying to find a way out, trying to escape. And then she said something that changed the entire complexion of the case. She said that a mysterious hand had reached and locked the door. That was indicating that she wasn't alone in that basement after all, and that someone else had been there with her who was able to reach and lock the door. Elfrieda's brother Alvin spent hours at her bedside. He was a grown man, but watching his sister suffer like this, hearing her struggle to breathe, seeing what had been done to her, it was really breaking him. Later, he would tell reporters that Elfrieda had whispered things to him privately during those vigils, things she made him promise not to repeat to the authorities. And those things, according to him, convinced Elfrieda's brother that her sister's initial statements about willingly burning herself were a complete lie. Whatever she told him in those private moments, it was enough to make Alvin certain that someone else bore the responsibility for what happened to his sister. But he never really disclosed what it was that Elfrieda told him, so there was no way for us to know what was the content of the conversation. And then on the third day, with her brother still present in the room, Elfrieda's eyes opened. She seemed this time more alert than she had been before, though still clearly in agony despite the morphine. So nurse moved closer to the bed, hoping that maybe this time Elfrieda would be able to tell them more clearer what really had happened in the basement. So Elfrieda looked up at the nurse and said that she wondered about something. So the nurse leaned in and asked her gently, "What do you wonder about?" Elfrieda's response was quiet but clear. "I wonder why they did it." The nurse felt her heart jump. They, not he. They. She tried to press Elfrieda, asking who she meant by they, who had done this to her. But Elfrieda just closed her eyes and didn't answer. Later that same day, consciousness returned to her one more time, and this time Elfrieda's words were clearer, more insistent, as if she was using whatever strength she had left to make herself understood. She hadn't done it, she said. She didn't do this to herself. They had done it. Again, not he, they, multiple people, plural. When asked again who they were, Elfrieda said that she couldn't remember. Or maybe she couldn't bring herself to say, and then she faded back into the unconsciousness before anyone could get any more information. At some point during those 4 days, someone asked Elfrieda a practical question. How had she even gotten into that furnace room? The building had been locked. How did she get inside? Through the haze of pain and medication, Elfrieda explained that on that night she was cold and that she had a key which could be found in the pocket of her coat. Elfrieda had been wearing a distinctive blue coat that day. Her sister had described it, along with the large buttons that decorated it. When Elfrieda was first discovered in the basement, There was no coat anywhere. Remember, she was completely naked. The investigators searched everywhere for it. They sifted through every ash and cinder in that furnace, looking for any remains of the garment. A heavy winter coat would have left substantial traces if it had been burnt. Buttons, zippers, the thick fabric, but there was literally nothing. The coat had vanished completely, and with it, any key that might have been in the pocket. So either she removed her coat before going down to the basement, or someone took it with them when they left Elfrieda in that furnace room. On November 2nd, 1928, 4 days after Chris Lewis found her standing in that basement, Elfrieda Knaak died from her injuries. She never provided a clear, consistent explanation of what had happened to her, and now she never would. After Elfrieda's death, investigators began trying to piece together what had actually happened in the basement. They examined every detail, every piece of physical evidence, and every statement Elfrieda had made. And the more they learned, the less sense any of it made. First, the police zeroed in on the statements made by the Elfrieda that she did it to herself. Dr. Alter Rissinger, who had examined Elfrieda's wounds when she first arrived at the hospital, provided investigators with an assessment that would become crucial to the case. He walked them through the mechanics of what have had to happen for Elfrieda to have inflicted these burns on herself. The furnace opening was pretty small, about 12 inches wide and about 8 inches tall. So in order for Elfrieda to do it to herself, first she would have needed to place her right foot into the furnace and hold it there for several minutes while standing on solid ground. The pain would have been instant and excruciating. Burning nerves, flesh melting, bones beginning to char. Then she would have needed to somehow balance on that destroyed foot, with nerves burned away, exposed bones and tissue gone, while placing her left foot into the flames and holding it there for several more minutes. Finally, while somehow maintaining balance on two catastrophically destroyed feet, she would have needed to thrust her head and arms into the fire and hold them there long enough to sustain the level of damage the doctors had observed. Dr. Rissinger explained to the investigators that the pain from even the first foot entering the flames would have caused unconsciousness almost immediately. The human body simply cannot withstand that level of trauma while remaining conscious and in control. The scenario they were being asked to believe, that Elfrieda had methodically burned herself in this way, was essentially impossible from a medical standpoint. Now remember Elfrieda's passion for spiritism and occult? Some investigators suggested an alternative theory. Maybe Elfrieda's deep involvement in spiritual practices and occult had somehow rendered her immune to pain. Maybe she reached some kind of altered state that allowed her to endure what would normally be unendurable. Dr. Rissinger acknowledged that he had found some evidence in medical literature of religious practices when people experienced altered pain perception in extreme circumstances. He speculated that perhaps Elfrieda might have somehow reached that state of spiritual exhalation that could potentially, theoretically, have allowed her to endure such self-inflicted trauma. But even as he offered this possibility, he emphasized that it was just that, a possibility, not a medical conclusion. He personally found it hard to believe. Now, the physical evidence in the basement only deepened the mystery. Mixed in with the ashes and coal, investigators found charred remains of some of Elfrieda's clothing. But her shoes, wristwatch, and purse had been placed in a neat pile about 12 feet from the furnace. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of a fight. Everything suggested this had been methodical, deliberate, and organized. But if someone else had done it to her against her will, how had they kept her there without any evidence of resistance? And if she had done it to herself, how had she maintained that level of calm, organized composure? The building itself presented another impossibility. Every door leading into the village hall had been locked from the outside the previous night. Police Chief Rosenhagen confirmed that when he had arrived that morning at his usual time. All the doors remained locked. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The building security had been completely uncompromised and intact. And this is where things got strange. The basement's rear door, the door Elfrieda claimed to have tried to escape through, the door where she said that mysterious hand had locked her in, was found hooked from the inside with a little wire latch. She could have unhooked it herself if she'd wanted to leave. Unless, of course, someone had hooked it after she was already too injured to reach it. Or unless the detail about trying to escape had been part of the morphine-induced confusion. And then there was an issue with the furnace itself. When Chris Lewis and Chief Rosenhagen found Elfrieda that morning, the furnace was stone cold. Not warm, not even lukewarm, completely cold. If someone had used that furnace hours earlier to inflict burns severe enough to destroy half of Elfrieda's body, the metal would still be retaining significant heat. The entire basement would probably have reeked of smoke and burning flesh, a smell that would have lingered probably for hours. Instead, the air was still and cold, carrying no trace of fire at all. Every piece of physical evidence seemed to point to the same conclusion. What Elfrieda initially claimed to have done to herself was physically impossible. Charles Hitchcock immediately became the primary focus of the investigation. The circumstances seemed to point directly at him. He had been scheduled to work as the night watchman that evening. He had a key to the building. Elfrieda had made that phone call from Highland Park and then deliberately traveled to Lake Bluff with a round-trip ticket, suggesting she had planned to meet someone and then return back home. She had called him Hitch in the hospital. The connection was pretty clear. But Hitchcock had an alibi, and it was backed by documented medical evidence. He had been in a car accident that badly fractured his ankle. He had called in sick that evening because his ankle, according to him, had been causing him too much pain to work. The injury had been x-rayed at the time, the break was real, it was documented, and it was pretty serious. His ankle was in a cast and everything, and he maintained that he had never left his home that entire night, and that the pain was just too severe to even consider going out. His wife, Estelle, had been at work herself that evening and couldn't confirm or contradict his account. On October 31st, 1928, the day after Elfrieda was found, a newspaper was able to interview Hitchcock. What he said would reveal the nature of their relationship. He described how he would coach Elfrieda extensively in sales techniques, how he would shape her approach, and then he said something particularly striking. She had obeyed him implicitly. She had followed his guidance completely without question. The phrasing suggested that sort of a level of control that went a little bit beyond the typical teacher-student dynamic, He was even asked directly if he had any ability to hypnotize people. He said no, but he mentioned that during his acting career, he had encountered men who could put people into trances. He specifically named Harry Houdini as someone he had known who possessed such abilities. And despite his denial, when Hitchcock had come to visit Elfrieda during those 4 days she was dying, her condition would seem to change. The heavy sedation that had been keeping her relatively quiet and unaware would lift somewhat. She would become more alert, more responsive. Some of the nurses described it almost like a spell being broken when he entered her room. It was probably just coincidence or maybe her body's stress response to seeing him, but it had been noticeable enough that several people commented on it. The investigation, however, couldn't solely focus on Hitchcock though, and Elfrieda had mentioned another name in her dying words. Remember, she said, "Frank turned me down"? Detectives began searching for information about anyone named Frank in Elfrieda's life. What they discovered added another strange, twisted layer to this case. There was a man named Frank Mandy. He was a violin teacher who shared a studio space in Waukegan with none other than Charles Hitchcock. The two men worked in the same building next to each other, teaching their different skills to many of the same clients. When investigators questioned Mandy, he claimed he had never even known Elfrieda. Never met her, never spoke to her. But given that he shared workspace with Hitchcock and Elfrieda had been taking classes there, investigators found his denial suspicious. Beyond Hitchcock and Mandy, investigators pursued several other leads, but none of them really led them anywhere. The most puzzling lead involved Elfrieda's closest friend, a woman named Marie Muller, a stenographer from Waukegan. She and Elfrieda had been close for years. They had even taken Hitchcock's public speaking classes together. So when Marie talked to police, investigators expected her to provide insight into Elfrieda's state of mind in the weeks before her death. Some kind of details about her relationship with Hitchcock, anything really that might help explain what had happened. But Marie seemed unable or unwilling to provide much useful information at all. She claimed she hadn't seen Elfrieda for about 6 weeks before the incident, which was pretty strange for two women described by everyone as best friends. But then investigators discovered something that made Marie's testimony even more puzzling. On the night of October 29, the same night Elfrieda ended up in that basement, Marie had gone to the Lake Bluff police station around midnight and asked to see Charles Hitchcock. But he wasn't there, so she just left. When investigators asked Marie about this visit, she said she'd been worried about something, but she wouldn't really elaborate or specify what was she worried about. Among Elfrieda's personal belongings, investigators found a diary. Most of the entries were pretty mundane, like notes about sales, calls, reminders, everyday observations, and so on. But one entry dated October 10th stood out. That was just 19 days before her death. She had written that she had spent the afternoon making sales calls but hadn't closed any deals. Then at 6 that evening, she had called someone she identified in her diary only as H. And the H said that they should meet soon. H for Hitchcock? Probably. At the end of this investigation, the coroner's jury heard all the evidence. The medical impossibilities, the electrocution, Elfrieda's shifting statements, from her purification ritual to Frank, to a mysterious hand, to the final insistence that they did it. And despite everything, on November 6, 1928, the jury reached the verdict. Elfrieda Knaak came to her death by burns, which appeared from the evidence to be self-inflicted. The official conclusion was suicide. Case closed. Charles Hitchcock was never charged with anything related to Elfrieda's death. The Lake Bluff police closed the investigation. Hitchcock continued working as the night watchman and teaching his elocution classes, and life in a small town kind of just went on. So the official story ended there. Elfrieda Knaak's burial and the coroner's verdict of suicide. But the actual story continued for decades. 9 months later, in July of 1929, Charles Hitchcock and his son were arrested for burglary. Both confessed, the son went to prison. Charles's charges were dismissed by state attorney. Why? Because the state attorney was a personal friend and former student of Hitchcock's elocution classes. In 1934, Hitchcock divorced his wife Estelle and left Lake Bluff. Then, in 1943, 15 years after Elfrieda's death, he remarried. His new wife was Marie Muller, Elfrieda's closest friend, the woman who had gone to that police station looking for Hitchcock on the night of October 29, 1928, the night when Elfrieda died. Years later, the Lake Bluff History Museum acquired a letter from Marie's niece, Eleanor Muller Finneran. In it, Eleanor revealed what the family had always known. Both Marie and Elfrieda had been in love with Charles Hitchcock. To Marie, he was like a god. She never questioned him, never doubted him, even after everything that happened. Charles Hitchcock died in 1964, 36 years after Elfrieda's death, never charged with anything related to her case. Marie survived him by 3 decades, dying in 1994. Neither of them ever changed their stories about what happened that night. The Lake Bluff Police Department never reopened the investigation, and the truth about what happened on October 29, 1928 remains buried. Maybe the truth died with Elfrieda in that hospital bed. Maybe it died with Hitchcock in 1964 or Marie in 1994. Or maybe it's still out there, buried in the details of that impossible case, waiting for someone to finally make sense of it all. And that's gonna be it for today's tale. Let me know what you think of it in the comments below. I read and reply to all of them. Thank you all very much for tuning in, I really appreciate it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications to never miss a tale. I post every Thursday, so be sure to come back and check it out next week. Stay curious, my friends, stay safe, and until next time.